This is Florida Gulf Coast University.
A law enforcement officer's first line of defense is usually a non-lethal weapon like a baton or pepper spray, maybe a taser or a stun gun. But what guarantees the equipment is safe for law enforcement use or is as non-lethal as intended? Turns out not much. But a local research institute aims at changing that with safety standards, or at least safety testing. Find out more on this edition of FGCU Perspectives. Our guest is Charlie Maslow, Associate Professor in Justice Studies at FGCU, and also the founding director of the Weapons and Equipment Research Institute. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Somebody asks you what you do for a living, social event. What do you answer?
I tell them I test law enforcement equipment for the Department of Justice, primarily less lethal weapons, but other types of law enforcement equipment too.
We've got some video of what you folks work on. Let's take a look at that. Okay.
Safety off, pins out, bang. Pins out, bang. Ah.
There at the end, you turn away from an explosion. What happened there?
I didn't throw the grenade far enough. That's actually a non-lethal fragmentary grenade, and I think I was afraid of throwing it over the fence and landing in a street and hitting a car. So I was trying to aim for the ditch and it bounced funny. So it didn't quite go as far as I wanted, and then I got hit in the face with some of the little rubber balls.
But you end up testing some very spectacular weaponry.
Absolutely. Stuff that actually isn't even on the market in some places. Some of the things have been around for 30 years and they don't have a lot of notoriety yet. Some of them are notorious for other things too, like horrific malfunctions.
Tell me more about the malfunctions, because that's a big part of why you're here.
Almost every area of less lethal weapons we've tested, with actually the only exception being taser, has some type of flaw built into it. I don't think it was designed that way. It's some type of design flaw that crept in at some point that causes the weapon just not to work properly. Some of them, they just don't fire, and that's bad, but it's worse when they explode, and they explode in the gun. Disable the gun and sometimes disable the officer. When I'm doing testing, I'm wearing a helmet and Kevlar and a face shield and a chest protector and as much equipment as I can put on myself, and I still get banged around pretty good. An officer that's wearing street clothes is going to take quite a thumping.
When we talk about less lethal, as you say, non-lethal, as I had said, is there a definition you work with for what those things include?
Well, non-lethal is advertising something we can't promise. I don't think there's anything that is totally non-lethal. Less lethal, it's less lethal than a bullet. We can promise you that. A bullet's going to kill you most of the time. Most of these objects, even when they malfunction, probably aren't going to kill you, but they can hurt you badly. Even if they're used right and they operate the proper way. When they work badly, obviously more injuries do occur. So I like less lethal. It's a little more accurate for people to get their head around. I mean, if I take a handful of rice and propel it fast enough out of a barrel, I can kill you with rice. So well, how can rice be lethal? Well, under normal circumstances it can't, but it's that 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 chance, and it's just easier to advertise it that way.
Were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, were there devices or products called by this title?
Oh, and sometimes people still do. And usually I don't think they're trying to be malicious when they do that. They simply are marketing it in a way that people are more likely to buy it, or that they can understand it a little bit better. But 20 years ago, there really weren't that many on the market. We're talking about, when I was a police officer, I had a wooden stick when I started. Then I ended up with a side handle baton. And then, the Rodney King incident, we got rid of side handle batons and went to expandable metal batons. and a pepper spray, and then impact munitions that could be fired from shotguns, and then taser came along, and so more and more devices come along, but really there's not really a thought out plan on how they develop. It's simply a market driven by the purchases of the police department, and if the police department say they want something, somebody will develop it for them.
For those of us not in law enforcement, what's the specific use for products like that? What are they there for?
Well, that's the problem. Is it's not one-stop shopping. You know, a taser is good under certain environments. Pepper spray is good in some environments. It just depends what you're trying to use it on. Tasers tend to be used on 1 or 2 people at a time. Pepper spray, you can take out a crowd, but you have to be very close to be able to reach them with the spray. Impact munitions are meant to shoot a greater distance and hit them either with a blunt object or a blunt object and a chemical payload. So they not only get hit by something going 300 feet per second, they also get a powder that lands on them which burns. Just a lot of different products trying to meet all these individual needs. Riot control is completely different than what an officer normally would be dealing with on the street. And yet all those products are for sale at the same time.
So how does an institute like yours come to a community like ours?
Oh, it was really following the trends with the Department of Justice and the grants at the time. And we simply applied over a certain period of time and started getting funding. And
this would be funding for what?
In the beginning, it was very broad-based testing. It was just provide a service to the law enforcement community. And it really didn't give us a lot of parameters, which was actually kind of nice because we would go to the trade shows, see what was coming out, and then we'd buy them. And we don't take freebies. We buy them. And sometimes we don't even tell the people who we are. We'll use a third-party shell company to buy the items, and that way they don't know they're selling it to a research lab.
Right.
Otherwise, we will get cherry-picked equipment, stuff that has been quality control checked 3 or 4 times, and it'll be the best product that's ever come off the line. And we've seen that a couple of times when we violated that and bought directly. And that's unfortunate because then the data is not as useful to us. It's better if we can buy it just from a catalog and they don't know who's selling, who they're selling it to, and at the end we get what the officer on the street would get.
But so you start out with some grants, you've got an interest in the kind of testing you're capable of doing. How does it develop into a full-fledged program?
Well, I mean, that was our plan in the beginning. When we wrote our first proposal, it was to create an institute and do the testing. And then after that, we piggybacked on the existing program because we had equipment. We had testing equipment at that point. And in the beginning, we were shooting in parking lots on campus. We were shooting in the dump on campus where they had all the yard waste. And we do test in all these different places. And we kept getting moved around because we were very loud on campus. They didn't really like it. Sounded like we were doing a Civil War reenactment. So a lot of times we would, we just kept being bounced around. Eventually, we got the right grant that allowed us to rent an off-campus facility, and that's when it kind of came together. We really had the ability, we had an 8,000 square foot facility that allowed us to test pretty much anything we wanted. We had 25 yards of testing range inside that we could use to test even long-range projectiles, pepper sprays. We have large fans to vent the rooms. We do pretty much just almost any type of weapon you can think of. We try to stay away from hardball ammunition, like real bullets. We're not set up to do that. And there is some type of market control on bullets. It's just the less lethal ammunition, there's nothing.
And you say that, again, somebody that's not in law enforcement, I would assume that all these things had been vetted beyond my understanding, and that there were great concerns for safety, but that's not necessarily the case.
No, in fact, we're getting the feel that that's exactly what they don't want. Many of the agencies that have funded some of our research don't want to get into regulatory. They don't want to become a regulatory agency, even though in some cases they regulate body armor. What is acceptable levels of protection for body armor. Now they're involved with handcuffs and riot helmets. I don't know why they don't go into these other areas. Perhaps it's just harder to regulate that. I don't see why it's harder to regulate that. I would think it would be relatively simple to regulate it. The same way they did it with body armor, which is you can't use federal funds to purchase a body armor that has not have an approval rating of a certain level. If you want to buy it, you're certainly welcome to, but don't use our federal money for it. I would suggest the same thing on most of these other products.
So lawmen are armed with these non-lethal devices or products that might not work as they think they would.
No, some of them won't work at all. Some of them work to some degree, but they don't work to the level that the officer might think they do, and they're certainly not as accurate as they think they are. And so when they fail, a lot of times the officer might even be stunned for a moment, being unsure as to what to do. It didn't work, and not only didn't it work, now the gun's broken. And now their hands are tied up with this weapon. Now what do you do with this thing? It's, you know, a $400 or $500 item sometimes. Sometimes it's a several $1,000 item. You can't just pitch it onto the street and go get something else. It'll disappear, and then you're responsible for it. So a lot of times it's mostly disbelief, but really we actually follow the blogs. You know, there's a lot of law enforcement blogs, and we listen to what people are saying around the country. And that guides a lot of our research. Is when I hear a bad story, we want to find out what happened. Sometimes we'll contact them, and a lot of times they're suspicious of us. They don't know who I am. For all they know, I'm a media outlet trying to scoop a story. But if they look us up, and a lot of times they will give us the inside information, enough for us to move forward and do some type of testing.
And what have you found in some of your, examples of things that didn't work the way they were supposed to?
We have smoke grenades that explode, that instead of generating smoke, they just detonate. We have diversionary devices that explode prematurely, which could blow your arm off. In fact, this last summer, 2 officers died from in the United States from flashbang malfunctions that actually killed them. And it's real easy. I mean, it's like holding a little hand grenade in your hand. When it goes off, it's going to really cause some damage. We have ammunition that blows up in the gun, and if it's a rapid firing weapon, the next round will then impact what's stuck in the barrel, and it will explode too. Or if you're really firing fast, you could have 2 or 3 explode in rapid succession. We have pepper sprays where they've lied on the ingredient list, and the material safety data sheets aren't accurate. And they try to hide behind the Trade Secrets Act and say, well, that's why we didn't put that information in there. And while they're putting chemicals in it, which really aren't even totally approved for human use. They're more used in veterinary medicine, and in one case, they're using dry cleaning solvent as their active ingredient. So it's, I could make, I've told people before, you can make pepper spray in your bathtub if you want. And if you've got a way to package it and sell it, there's nobody that's going to stop you. And you can just watch the lawsuits on a couple of these brands just go up, up, up each year, and yet nobody knows why. The problem is, because they're covered under the Trade Secrets Act, I'm liable if I actually go on record and give that information away. I give it away privately. I tell people one-on-one, but I can't put it on the internet. I've written it up. I've sent it to the Department of Justice, to the Attorney General's office. I thought somebody might do something, but really it's an unregulated industry, and they're not really listening.
Is there a trend towards more of these devices and products being used?
Absolutely. It's this. We don't want to shoot as many people with bullets. We're always trying to find new and better weapons. Taser probably is the only one that I can say that actively built in quality control in the first days. And I really try not to be a spokesperson for any of the products, but really when you've got a product that's got like a 99.99% reliability, that's pretty darn good. They do quality control. They x-ray the gun and the cartridge before it leaves the factory to make sure that it's assembled right. When I had one of our beanbag rounds that we tested, and they normally go out about 280 feet per second, and I ended up having one that went out about 970. So about the speed of a .45 caliber bullet. It would have killed you, if you had been hit by it, it would have killed you at about 20 yards, just from the kinetic energy. The company said, well, yeah, I guess that could have happened. Maybe we put the wrong ammunition in it. Okay, well, how could that have happened? They really didn't want to recognize that, they either had somebody internally that had sabotaged their ammunition, which I'm starting to lean toward, or that they had some type of problem with the feed system that added the gunpowder to the shell. Instead, they said, well, it's possible somebody just put the wrong shells in the gun. In which case, well, we have the shell casing, and it says beanbag. How would you put a slug into that? Well, we don't know. That wouldn't have happened at Taser because they actually do quality control. This company had no idea what was even coming out the other end of the assembly line.
And if the trend then is for more of these devices or products to be used, using your term of less lethal, not non-lethal, but less lethal, more people are likely to be hurt by them.
They certainly could.
Even when they're working well.
Absolutely. Only because people don't, they haven't really figured out the operational limits on what the guns do, what the ammunition does. You go to an instructor school for this, and that instructor then will go back and teach the agency. But all of the information that instructor is teaching from is provided by the manufacturer, not from an outside source. So I go to the instructor schools. In fact, I've been to all of them. Any weapon we've tested, I've been to the instructor school for it. And I will go back and then look at their numbers, and then we'll test it, and they're never the same, not even close. I mean, they're way off. Obviously, they're selling a product. We understand it, market-driven economy. But what has to happen is you can't just lie and make up the numbers, or it makes it sound like your weapon will be able to accurately hit somebody at this distance, and when you don't hit them where you want, maybe you're going to shoot them in the eye or shoot them in the throat, someplace that's a target that's more likely to cause a serious injury or death. That's the problem we have. Yes, when these things explode, that's bad, but when they actually fire and go down range, but they don't go where you aim them, that can even be worse.
As I think about lawmen using this, do these show up in other fields? Do the military use similar products?
Absolutely. Military's a little more savvy about what they buy. They don't buy 1,000 different brands. There's primarily 3 major companies that sell the impact munitions, but there's probably 150 or 200 little shops that make them too. The big 3 are relatively regulated, but one of those was the one that had the beanbag that went really, really fast. One of them had another malfunction that exploded in a gun. The other one had another malfunction I can't recall. So all 3 of the big companies have had problems too. The little companies are worse. The military doesn't mess with that. Right. They have their own standards. Those companies will make ammunition for the military at a completely different standard than they'll make for law enforcement. That's mil-spec standards. And so I don't know why law enforcement doesn't pay the extra money and say, I want mil-spec standards on my ammo, but they don't. They just buy it as is, in which case you get what you get. It's like a grab bag. And so maybe that beanbag's coming out at 200 feet per second, and maybe it's coming out at 1,200 feet per second, 1,000 foot per second difference between the two. You don't know the difference when you pull the trigger. It's going to look the same, it's going to sound the same. The only difference you're going to see is the guy doesn't get up. You're going to say, wow, he should be dusting himself off about now. And he's not moving because you killed him.
I did a little inventory, knowing that we were going to have this conversation today, of the things that I know about non-lethal munitions. And everything I know comes from fiction. It's something I read in a novel, it's something I saw on television, or it's something I saw in a movie. Yet I've got this great knowledge of the subject. Do you run into any issues around that where people just know so much about it, although it's wrong?
Yeah, well, most people don't shoot a lot of beanbag ammunition. They don't shoot tasers and set off grenades. So what they see is in the movies.
Right.
And that's what they base their entire worldview as far as less lethal weapons go. So I laugh. I have a hard time watching Hollywood movies that use less lethal because they're very unrealistic. You shoot somebody with a taser and it makes them unconscious. And it's like, you couldn't do that if you tried. You could cook them for an hour and they're not going to, unless they just faint at some point. But it doesn't make you unconscious. Pepper spray in the movies tends to be more of a joke. The people act like that's not a big deal, which actually it's kind of a big deal. You see batons working properly in martial arts movies and Bruce Lee swinging nunchucks around. But in reality, yes, those nunchucks would have hurt if he had hit those people with it, but they probably would have got Bruce Lee in most of those movies because that's not how it works either. That's not how kinetic energy works. We have to deal with urban legends all the time. Our biggest problem was one of the TV shows that was on the Discovery Channel that had a relatively famous actor that was running it, was doing some military weapons, like a military weapons demonstration. And the way it was filmed, it made it look like this semi-automatic shotgun could cycle the beanbag ammunition. Now, up until recently, they couldn't. Now, we actually have 2 prototype weapons now that will at the Institute. But on the market, there aren't any right now. Back then, there were 0. I was pretty dubious that this could even happen, just because I know how much gunpowder it takes to make a semi-automatic action cycle, so it was unlikely that was happening. So we bought one, and we dropped $2,500 on this gun, simply to prove that it was fake. We bought it, we bought the ammunition, and we fired, a couple hundred shots, and none of them ever cycled. It jammed every shot. We look on the internet, and there's blogs after blogs of people saying how it will cycle. It wouldn't end. I mean, it was all over the place. We talked to our firearms distributor that we buy most of our purchases through. They swear that it will cycle. Now, this is after we already own it. We already know the difference. Them swearing that they've seen it cycle. We call the company that manufactures the gun. They say, absolutely, it's impossible to cycle. We're not saying it does, and we have no idea what they did on that television show to make it cycle. Turns out it was edited film. He'd take a shot, and then they'd cut the film, he would cycle the gun manually, and then they'd start the film again. And so when they put it all back together, it looked like the gun was working a certain way when it actually didn't.
And it becomes part of the legend.
It did, except a lot of stimulus money went into that. I mean, a boatload of stimulus money all over the country, to the point where we rushed a report through. It's only about 7 or 8 pages, and we had the Department of Justice release it as quickly as possible, because these guns were a couple $1,000s each. Now, at the end, we had a gun we really couldn't use, so we donated it to the campus police department. But because it will never do what we want it to do. There's no way for us to fix it to make it do something different. But there's an example of an urban legend based on television that just wouldn't go away, and it probably still is out there.
So if a big part of what you do is testing and looking for standards, are there other research paths that you're able to follow as well in an institute like yours?
We do all sorts of different, we look at canine research from time to time. We do night vision equipment testing, highway flares. It really depends on what the needs are. I mean, I wouldn't have picked highway flares or night vision, but that was a written proposal that had been put out by the Department of Justice at that time, that they wanted some testing in that area. So we wrote up our proposal to see if if they'd like us to do it, and they said yes, and we were funded to do it. Not one of my highlights, because it's not as exciting, because with infrared beacons, it means you're walking out around in the woods in the dark, and it's raining, and you have to test in a whole bunch of environments. And the same thing with the highway flares. It means you have to find a stretch of roadway there's no cars on, and be out there in rain and heat and dark, and see how they work. So those weren't the highlights, but we test just about anything. And if a need comes up, if there's a way we can modify what we're doing to pick up another project, we often do. And currently we're helping 2 companies that, they've got some prototypes. They wanted us to look at them, and we're doing that. We'll look at them, and we'll make a recommendation back to them. Now, we don't promote anybody's weapons, but we'll tell them what they can do to fix whatever's wrong with it. And then if they fix it, send it back to us, then we'll test it again, and if it meets any type of reasonable standard, we'll write a report that explains, what the weapon did under our testing environment. But we'll never say, it's got our seal of approval, because that's not the business we're in.
You teach. What do students get out of classes around this subject?
Well, at different times, I had a whole bunch of service learning students, and I had a bunch of graduate students. I'm only down to 2 graduate students now that work for me full time. In the spring, we teach a class on less lethal weapons. And that's 20 or 30 students, and their lab fee, they pay a moderate lab fee, and that pays for their ammunition. And so as part, they have an academic portion of the class, and they have a hands-on portion every night. So if we're doing taser or stun gun research, we'll look at that in the first part in the classroom, and after that, we'll go outside on a test range, and everybody will shoot a taser or discharge a stun gun of some kind. We're doing beanbag ammunition, everybody will get a shotgun, one at a time. I don't just arm them like an army and send them out. One at a time under controlled conditions, I'll let them each shoot, so they get a chance to see what it's like.
And then funding. You talked about funding that got you started. You have some issues with funding now.
Well, the stimulus package, I guess, didn't do all that it could have done, at least at the research level. So we're pretty much out of money. We'll go out of money in April of 2012. So we've had a pretty good run, but I don't think there's a way to recover at this point. We're in pretty deep.
Any possibilities out there that you would hope for, or?
Well, we're working on a military contract right now, but it's not. I don't think it's large enough to keep us afloat. It's a stopgap measure, maybe for a short period of time. It would take a a moderate infusion of capital to keep this going. I mean, probably about $100,000 a year keeps this thing afloat. And given at the cost of these weapons, of what it costs to shoot them, most of the ammunition costs $20 a shot. And so you can see how that would get expensive pretty quickly, especially when we shoot no less than 400 shots of anything. That's just for statistical analysis.
And absent the money, what can you keep going? What part of your vision can you?
Really, after once the building closes down, we won't really have the ability to do the testing. The only thing we'll be able to do from that point forward is we have lots and lots of data, in which case we'll continue publishing it for a few years, until we use it up. But after that, it's kind of dead. Not much we can do about it. We'd sure like to have kept it afloat, but I don't know where else to go.
Well, we'll continue to watch for news and developments. Interesting program, and thank you for being part of our program today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And thank you for watching this edition of FGCU Perspectives.